There are plenty of spells in D&D 5th edition that were changed in the 2024 Player's Handbook that released last year. Some were buffed or changed completely in how they function to make them feel more in line with the design philosophy of the game overall. However, some spells didn't come out so lucky and were instead nerfed. So in today's video, we'll be going over a few spells that were either nerfed to feel weaker, or changed in ways that feel a bit underwhelming compared to their previous counterparts. And to start off at number 10, we have the notorious 7th level spell, Simulacrum. This spell comes with a 12-hour casting time and a range of touch, an infinite duration or until dispelled, and a few material components. Though the most important one is a powdered ruby worth at least 1500 gold, since it's consumed by the spell itself, making it a required component otherwise. As for what this spell does, it allows you to essentially create a duplicate of a beast or a humanoid within range. The duplicate counts as its own creature and can be affected normally as any other creature would. It appears the same as the original creature used for the spell, but has half the creature's maximum number of hit points, and doesn't come with any equipment by default. The illusion uses all of the statistics of the duplicated creature, except it is considered a construct, meaning healing spells can't affect it. The Simulacrum is friendly to you and creatures you designate, obeys your spoken commands, and acts on your turn in combat while doing its best to conform to your wishes and commands. However, the downside to this duplicate comes from the fact that it can't learn or become more powerful, preventing it from leveling up or learning new spells or abilities. It also can't regain spell slots once it expends them, limiting the number of spells it can use overall. You can repair the Simulacrum if it's damaged by using rare herbs and materials worth 100 gold per hit point it regains, and it must be repaired in an alchemical laboratory, otherwise the duplicate reverts to snow and melts immediately if it ever reaches 0 hit points. So there is a steep maintenance cost if you ever want to keep it around. Lastly, if you cast the spell again, any currently active duplicates you create with the spell are instantly destroyed. While having a clone of yourself walking around might seem like a fun idea, the limitations of never getting stronger or regaining spell slots might be a bit of a problem. However, it is an extra spellcaster in your party that efficiently increases your party's effectiveness exponentially, especially towards the endgame. Maintaining the Simulacrum can also be a problem since 100 gold per hit point can add up extremely quickly. This all eventually leads into one of the most infamous exploits in 5th edition. First, reach 17th level as a wizard and learn the Wish spell. Second, cast Simulacrum to make a duplicate of yourself. While the Simulacrum doesn't have its 7th level spell slot to cast Simulacrum again without expending higher level spell slots, it does come loaded with the Wish spell. One of the components of Wish allows the caster to replicate any spell of 8th level or lower, ignoring material costs and any other requirements for the spell. The effects of the spell also instantly happen, so it significantly reduces the cast time of Simulacrum from 12 hours to just 1 action. With this in mind, you have your Simulacrum use Wish to make a Simulacrum of you at no additional cost. And congratulations! You now have another Simulacrum that doesn't have its 7th level spell slot, but still access to the Wish spell, since you yourself haven't used it, to which you can repeat the process infinitely. And since the Simulacrum counts as its own creature, it doesn't count against the number of Simulacrums you can have, since each Simulacrum would technically have its own Simulacrum, and so on and so on. The only catch is that you still need the initial 1500 gold worth of powdered rubies in order to even start the chain in the first place, and a high enough level to have Wish and Simulacrum together. Understandably, this combo is usually outright banned from most tables, and no sensible DM would allow such a thing to happen in the first place, unless they were a fan of pure unadulterated chaos. That being said, the 2024 version of Simulacrum answers the problem of this exploit by changing a couple of things. While the cast time and everything else is relatively the same, the new change to the spell makes it so that the Simulacrum is unable to cast this spell. Everything else is relatively the same, but just worded differently. It copies the game statistics of the original creature at the time of casting, it's still a construct, and while it could theoretically regain spell slots now, the spell doesn't explicitly state it can't regain spell slots anymore, it can't take short or long rests. So actually, no it can't. It still can't gain levels and etc, etc. Basically, Simulacrum in 2024 is worded to be a bit clearer with the caveat that it can't just cascade infinitely by casting Simulacrum. Even if your Simulacrum tries to use Wish to cast Simulacrum, it simply doesn't because of the way the 2024's version of Wish is worded. If you use it this way, you don't need to meet any requirements to cast that spell, including costly components. While this wording isn't exactly the same for the original version of Wish, If you're using the 2024 version of Simulacrum, then it's also safe to assume that you would be using the 2024 version of Wish, which has received some changes, but that's a topic for another video entirely. Overall, Simulacrum is one of those spells that is just infamous for breaking games, if it's allowed to run rampant. It's essentially equivalent to the Peasant Cannon, only this actually works rules as written. However, since this nerf actually improves the health of the game overall by fixing a known exploit, it's not really worth putting at a high spot on this list, since most tables outright ban the combo anyway, or one of the spells used to perform the combo. In a normal game, this change doesn't affect much, so it takes the number 10 spot on this list. And imprisoning creatures for long periods of time at the number 9 spot on this list, we have the 7th level spell, Forcecage. This spell costs an action to cast, requires ruby dust worth 1500 gold as material costs, and comes with a 1 hour duration that doesn't require concentration to maintain. What this spell does is it creates an immovable, invisible, cube-shaped prison made up of a magical force around an area that you choose within range, imprisoning everything within the cage or box that you create. The prison, that's a cage, can be up to 20 feet on a side, and is made of 1/2 inch diameter bars spaced an inch apart, while a box prison can be up to 10 feet on a side and prevents any matter from passing through it while also blocking any spells into or out of the area. While you do trap every creature that's inside of the Forcecage while casting the spell, any creature that is only partially inside or too large to fit in it is pushed away from the center of the area until they are completely outside of the spell's area. So be mindful of where you cast the spell if you want to maximize the number of catches you get with your prison. If that wasn't enough, creatures that are inside the cage can't leave by non-magical means either. And even if they do use something non-magical, such as a teleportation spell or interplanar travel, to leave the cage, they must first succeed a charisma saving throw. If they don't, the creature wastes its use of the spell or effect, and as a cherry on top, the cage also blocks ethereal travel. So creatures can't even use something like Blink Spell to enter the ethereal plane to try and simply walk out of it. Forcecage also can't be dispelled by Dispel Magic either, which makes this spell a very oppressive and difficult spell to work around when used correctly. Essentially, you can just trap enemies inside of it and lock them out of combat while the rest of your party cleans up whatever's left over before leaving the imprisoned enemies to their fate for the next hour. Or if you're feeling really cheeky, you could have a party member cast a lingering AoE spell like Sickening Radiance on their turn while you trap them inside of the area, using Forcecage and force all of the trapped creatures to make con saves every turn for the next 10 minutes, which would be a slow but guaranteed death no matter how you look at it. Essentially, Sickening Radiance is a 4th level concentration spell that lasts for up to 10 minutes. It creates a 30-foot radius sphere at a point you choose within 120 feet, and forces every creature within it willingly move inside of it or starts its turn there to make constitution saves or take 4d10 radiant damage, as well as gain 1 level of exhaustion. This means that creatures stuck inside the Sickening Radiance will end up making 100 constitution saving throws over the span of the 10 minutes. Since it's unlikely for a creature to successfully save this many times, this guarantees that a creature will either die of the radiant damage or by taking 6 levels of exhaustion. It is important to keep in mind, however, that you can't do this combo by placing the Forcecage first, since Forcecage specifies that spells are blocked from being cast into or out of the area if you're making a box. However, nothing says you can't cast Sickening Radiance into a Forcecage that's been shaped into a cage, nor is there anything that prevents you from casting a spell beforehand to initiate this hotbox strat. While you technically are able to perform this combo yourself, since Forcecage doesn't require concentration, that would require you to ensure that creatures don't move out of your Sickening Radiance before your next turn, where you would then trap them with your Forcecage. That being said, this only applies to the 2014 version of the spell, as the 2024 version has received a couple of small changes that have big ramifications. The first change is the fact that the spell now consumes your 1500 gold worth of ruby dust, making it harder and much more expensive to cast overall. The second change is the fact that it now requires concentration, which means the spell can now end much earlier by taking damage and failing your concentration check to maintain the spell. While granting the spell a concentration component can help by allowing the caster the ability to free a creature inside of it that they only wanted to imprison temporarily, that's usually not the case when it comes to such a high level spell. In fact, adding concentration to Forcecage severely cripples the spell, as it basically makes it a glorified Wall of Force spell. Wall of Force is a 5th level concentration spell that lasts for up to 10 minutes instead of an hour like Forcecage, and basically works the same way, except it doesn't prevent creatures from teleporting and doesn't stop all spells. Just prevents anything from physically passing through it. But you can shape the force into a dome to block creatures from leaving the area and essentially achieve the same outcome as Forcecage. While Forcecage can be made a bit bigger than Wall of Force has a lot more flexibility and utility if you're going to pick which concentration spell you want to use. And with Wall of Force not coming at the cost of an arm and a leg, you might just be better off with this spell than Forcecage at this point. While Forcecage is a very strong spell in the 2014 version of the game, they could have done pretty much anything else to make it weaker but still usable. However, it is definitely still a usable spell, just not one that will likely be used nearly as much as before. And since it still has the exact same functionality as before, it takes the number 9 spot on this list as a result. Shockingly, at number 8 on this list, we have an old fan favorite, Shocking Grasp. This cantrip requires an action to cast, has a range of touch, it deals 1d8 lightning damage to a creature hit with a melee spell attack roll, and as with all cantrips, the damage does scale at 5th, 11th, and 17th levels, increasing the damage by 1d8 each time. However, there are two major components that make this spell extremely good. First, if your target is wearing armor made of metal, you have advantage on your attack roll against it. The second thing, and arguably more important, is that whenever you hit a creature with Shocking Grasp, they're locked out of taking any reactions until the start of its next turn. So if you're a wizard that's being rushed down by a melee attacker, instead of using a 2nd level spell slot to cast Misty Step to teleport away from them to avoid taking any opportunity attacks, you can gamble an attack roll using Shocking Grasp to try and turn off the reactions full stop to try and reposition yourself safely. While this is the most common use of this cantrip, some creatures might have very powerful reactions that are worth turning off. A Merilith, for instance, is a CR16 creature that has the reactive trait, giving it the ability to take one reaction every single turn in combat, rather than once per round. This could make it very annoying to fight against, because this means it can use its parry reaction to increase its AC by 5 for one attack every turn. So hitting it with a Shocking Grasp to turn off its reactive trait can make the fight so much more manageable for your entire team if you manage to pull it off. Assuming, of course, you can get past the first parry. Unfortunately, this is no longer the case in the 2024 iteration of the spell. In 2024, Shocking Grasp only locks a creature's opportunity attack until the start of its next turn, rather than all reactions full stop, and you no longer get advantage on attack rolls if the target is wearing metal armor. While it was nice having advantage on certain kinds of creatures if you wanted to go for damage, losing the ability to turn off all reactions makes Shocking Grasp less of an offensive tool and more of a defensive one overall. There's no going in to turn off a creature's reaction after finding out how annoying it is, and no charging in with a handful of lightning on a heavily armored guard or a bandit with advantage to hit. You can, however, still go in, hit them with Shocking Grasps, and then leave using the rest of your movement without provoking opportunity attacks if you really want it. Fortunately, despite Shocking Grasp's recent dip in power level, it's still a viable cantrip, since really all that's changed is that it now only does what most casters used to use the cantrip for in the first place, which is why it takes number 8 spot on this list. While it's understandable that deleting a target's reaction as a cantrip might sound overpowered, and needing to be called back a bit, it's such a shame that it came at the cost of Shocking Grasp's overall versatility. Did it really need to lose its advantage on metal armored targets, for instance? Inflicting Pain at the number 7 spot on this list is the 1st level spell Inflict Wounds. This is a spell that's usually only available to the Cleric class unless you're taking certain subclasses or feats that grant you the spell. It costs an action to cast, has a range of touch, and deals a really nice 3d10 necrotic damage on hit, making this the most damaging 1st level spell in the game. Of course, the major trade-off is that you have to be right in front of your opponent's face to use the spell in the first place. But when you're a cleric that can just heal or buff themselves or their allies, or are a war cleric, suddenly being in front of enemies doesn't sound so scary. You do have to make a melee spell attack in order to hit though. However, when you have spells like Bless, which grant you an extra 1d4 to roll for every attack roll or saving throw you make, Inflict Wounds sounds more like a go-to option than using your normal weapon in most cases. Unfortunately, as mentioned before, the biggest downside of the spell is the fact that it's only available to clerics outside of a few niche situations, making it a relatively hard spell to obtain on something like a wizard. But when you do, you have a solid damage option for creatures trying to push up to you. Why deal a measly 4d8 lightning damage to a creature and delete the reaction, when you can instead upcast and Inflict Wounds to 5th level, dealing 7d10 necrotic damage and deleting their life instead. After all, no one expects the wizard to be packing such a strong melee option that isn't a booming blade most of the time. Sadly, all good things must come to an end, as the 2024 version of Inflict Wounds sees two major changes. The first is a change to its overall damage, which is now 2d10 rather than 3d10. The second change is that it no longer requires a melee spell attack roll, but instead requires a target to make a Constitution saving throw to avoid taking full damage. While the consistency of Inflict Wounds damage has gone up by allowing the spell to still deal half damage on a successful save, its overall damage has decreased quite a bit. Instead of its previous 16.5 necrotic damage on average, it now deals an average of 11 necrotic damage. To put this into perspective, Guiding Bolt deals an average of 14 radiant damage, while Chromatic Orb deals an average of 13.5 of your choice between Acid, Cold, Fire, Lightning, Poison, or Thunder damage. Combine this with the fact that Constitution has, and still is, the worst stat to target in the game, due to most creatures having an inherently high Constitution score, and you've got yourself a spell that is now just a husk of its former self. While clerics do gain more power elsewhere, such as Spirit Guardians having new cheese tactics, losing so much power on a staple first level spell definitely hurts the cleric's overall offensive power. While clerics are usually seen as a healer support class, it's not uncommon for players to play them as an offensive support, focusing more on damage than keeping the party alive, which is why subclasses such as the War Cleric or Tempest Cleric are so popular amongst fans. So when changes like these made to Inflict Wounds happen, it creates less incentive for clerics to take more damage in options, which might feel bad for players that want to be a battle cleric. It also disincentivizes other spellcasters from trying to take Inflict Wounds for their own, and instead take other spells that are just objectively better. I mean, just take a look at all the changes Chromatic Orb has gotten, and tell me it's not the best first level spell now. As for why Inflict Wounds only takes number 7 on this list, while the nerfs do hurt the spell immensely, they don't make the spell outright useless. While missing your Inflict Wounds doesn't feel good, having the spell still deal half damage even if a creature is more likely to successfully save against it, at least grants the spell more consistency than it did before. Dealing 5 necrotic damage instead of no necrotic damage can make all the difference in terms of both combat and player mindset. And coming late to the party at number 6 is the 3rd level spell, Slow. This is a concentration spell that takes 1 action to cast and allows you to alter time around up to 6 creatures of your choice within a 40-foot cube within 120 feet range. They're unaffected if they successfully pass a Wisdom saving throw, and subjected to devastating debuffs for up to 1 minute if they fail. These debuffs include having their speed halved, a -2 penalty to their AC and Dexterity saving throws, can't use reactions, can only choose to take an action or bonus action each of their turns rather than both, and if they do use their action to attack, it can't make more than 1 melee or range attack during its turn. This spell also affects the way spellcasters can cast their spells, as they need to roll a 10 or lower on a d20 in order to successfully cast their spell that turn. Otherwise, the spell is delayed until the caster's next turn. If the creature can't complete its spell by using an action, either because it changed its mind or because creatures moved out of the spell's range, then the spell doesn't go off and it wastes a spell slot as a result. The only saving grace creatures have against the spell is that it does allow a repeatable wisdom save at the end of each of their turns to end the spell early. Slow is one of those extremely powerful 3rd level spells that can basically end combat at best, or turn an incredibly hard combat into an almost trivial one at worst. Like its 3rd level cousin, Hypnotic Pattern, Slow takes pride in making sure enemies can't operate at full capacity. While Hypnotic Pattern has more payoff for going off, as it incapacitates and reduces the creature's movement to 0 for its entire duration, making it a combat ender if ever an enemy gets caught in it, Slow has the benefit of smart casting. Simply put, Hypnotic Pattern runs the risk of hitting your allies if they get caught in the area, while Slow allows you to choose targets, basically avoiding your allies altogether. This comes at the cost of only being allowed to select up to 6 creatures, whereas Hypnotic Pattern's limit is how many creatures can fit inside of its area. Another thing that Slow technically has over Hypnotic Pattern is the fact that, unlike Hypnotic Pattern, it doesn't inflict a condition. The effect just happens. So even if the big bad evil guy managed to fail their saving throw after burning through its legendary resistances, there isn't anything the DM can do about it since there's no slow immunity in the game unless they cooked one up. Of course, they could also give the big bad evil guy a godly amount of wisdom to help them succeed, so there's always that. That being said, I use technically very loosely because there aren't really any creatures that are immune to incapacitation in the first place. The Crawling Claw and the Swarm of Crawling Claws from the 2025 Monster Manual come to mind, as well as the Warforged Colossus from Eberron Rising of the Last War, but that's really it. Both of these spells are just really good at shutting down any combat, even if you don't get all the targets you need. Cutting a combat down by even half is still better than fighting everything at full strength. Unfortunately, having two almighty powerful third level spells hell-bent on warping the game balance heavily towards the party's favor was not meant to be, as Slow did take a couple of notable hits in the 2024 Player's Handbook, but they're not so devastating as you might think. While most of the spell works relatively the same, the two major changes are actually to the casting spells part of the description. Instead of affecting all spells that cost one action, Slow now only affects spells that require somatic components, which makes a bit of sense since somatic components tend to be hand gestures and whatnot. The second change is to the chance of the spell failing, which can be seen as both a buff and a nerf. Instead of needing to roll a 10 or below on a d20 roll, or else you have your spell delayed until the next turn, there is now a 25% chance that the spell will just outright fail. While it's strange that one of the best spells in the game only got a slap on the hand as far as nerfs go, it does make the spell feel more intuitive, as having a chance for a spell to fail flows better in terms of combat than needing to remember that an 11 or higher on a d20 is actually bad for your character if you want to cast a spell while slowed, and then having to wait to figure out where your spell is going to go next turn, if it even can. Honestly, this is one of the lightest nerfs in the game, but it doesn't go unnoticed simply because, while there are a lot of spells with somatic components, there are plenty of great spells that don't even require somatic components in the first place. While things like Booming Blade, Bless, Shatter, Fireball, Haste, and Cone of Cold are some of the more common spells that can get screwed by slow spell, spells like Mind Sliver, Healing Word, Silvery Barbs, Tasha's Mind Whip, Rumulit's Cycled Lance, and Destructive Wave are all unaffected by the new version of Slow. Because of this, Slow takes the number 6 spot on this list, since reducing the effectiveness of the spell on spellcasters overall can actually be a pretty big deal, especially if your DM decides to switch out spells on their creatures, which is entirely within the rules for most stat blocks. And protecting its spot at number 5 is the first level spell Sanctuary. This is a bonus action spell that has a range of 30 feet and lasts for 1 minute without needing to spend your concentration on it. You choose one creature to ward with it, giving it protection from most sources of harm. Basically, while warded, any creature that targets them with an attack or harmful spell must first make a wisdom saving throw. If they fail, the attacking creature must choose a new target within range or lose the attack or spell altogether. This adds a layer of protection to your low health allies or people you want to try and protect in general. However, this protection does have one major weakness. If they're hit by an area effect spell, such as a fireball, then Sanctuary just doesn't work. And did I mention that this spell doesn't require concentration and last 1 whole minute? This means that even if a creature damages you, you won't drop the spell because it just works regardless of whether you want to drop it or not. Instead, the warded creature basically gets to decide when it drops by either making an attack, casting a spell that affects an enemy, or deals damage to another creature, in which case the spell ends. Even then, there are some pretty funny interactions you can have here. Since these are the only 3 conditions in which Sanctuary can be dropped, you can pop it on yourself as a cleric and then cast Beacon of Hope on your next turn, allowing you to choose nearby creatures, granting them the benefit of advantage on wisdom and death saves, while also allowing them to heal their maximum number of hit points possible from any source of healing and just cast healing spells the entire combat, since neither of these spells break Sanctuary. Of course, if you have other support characters in your party, you might be better off using Sanctuary on them instead, so that the waiting period on big support spells is much shorter. Sadly, this interaction has been removed completely in the updated version of the spell, as it now ends whenever the warded creature makes an attack roll, casts any spell, or deals damage at all. There's also another small change made to the spell that weakens its overall impact on the game, but not by much. Firstly, the offending creature must now only make a wisdom saving throw if it targets the warded creature with an attack roll or damaging spell, rather than a harmful spell. This can be seen as a nerf, since the term harmful could mean damage spells, or spells that have some sort of negative impact on the warded creature, such as a dominate person spell, for example. As for why Sanctuary takes number 5 spot on this list, it's mostly because the changes massively nerf the ability to choose encounters with support spells by adding an extra layer of protection for 10 whole rounds to your bard that just wants to sing and dance and spread its bardic inspiration all over the party from the save to the backline where no one can touch it, except with area of effect spells. Having your cleric become a beacon of hope to heal massive amounts of hit points at no risk is always fun, but can frustrate your DM that just wants to run a potentially challenging combat. So it does make sense why this is no longer allowed in the updated version. And contaminating the number 4 spot on this list is the 5th level spell Contagion. This necromancy spell costs an action to cast, has a range of touch, lasts for 7 days, and doesn't require any sort of concentration to maintain. You touch your target and make a melee attack roll against it, making it become poisoned on a successful hit. When poisoned this way, the target begins making constitution saving throws at the end of each of their turns in a similar manner to death saves. The condition ends upon making 3 successful saving throws with no further downsides, while something else happens upon 3 failed saves. If the creature fails 3 saving throws, the condition ends, but you get to choose one of 6 diseases to inflict the target with for the next 7 days. There's Blinding Sickness, which inflicts the creature with the blinded condition, and gives them disadvantage on wisdom checks and saving throws. Filth Fever and Seizure work the same way, where the target will have disadvantage on saving throws, ability checks, and attack rolls, using strength and dexterity respectively. Mind Fire gives the creature disadvantage on intelligence checks and saves, while also forcing them to behave as if they were under the effects of the Confusion spell during combat, which is a 4th level enchantment spell that essentially causes creatures to behave erratically in their turn, having what they do dictated by a d10 roll, and being unable to use reactions. Meanwhile, Slimy Doom causes creatures to have disadvantage on constitution checks and saves and become stunned until the end of its next turn every single time it takes damage. And then there's Flesh Rot, which is arguably the most dangerous and immediately helpful aside from Slimy Doom, where it imposes disadvantage on charisma checks, while crippling the target with vulnerability to all damage it takes, meaning that any damage dealt to it is straight up doubled. Usually you'd want to go for Flesh Rot or Slimy Doom because there's usually little chance for your target to even remain alive after using the spell, let alone for 3 rounds. However, every disease has its uses depending on the situation. That being said, none of these diseases matter anymore in the 2024 iteration of the spell, where Contagion has been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Instead of doing all of what was previously mentioned, Contagion now forces a constitution saving throw instead of requiring you to hit a creature with a melee spell attack, dealing 11d8 necrotic damage and inflicting the poison condition as usual. While poisoned this way, you get to choose one ability score to give it disadvantage with all of its saves using that ability. The target then does the usual rolling for 3 successes or 3 failures, ending the spell upon 3 successes. Upon 3 failures, the spell lasts for its usual 7 days with no further complications, other than an additional stipulation that whenever the poison target tries to end the poison condition via lesser restoration or by other means, the target must first succeed on a constitution saving throw or else it just doesn't work. While it's nice to see Contagion being able to deal a nice bit of damage now, it's on a constitution save, which we've established is the worst stat to target. But what makes this worse is the fact that the target doesn't even take half damage if they succeed against the spell, making this a pretty terrible save or suck spell where nothing happens if they succeed. If you're looking to deal heavy necrotic damage to a single target, then you may as well take a minus 2d8 deficit and upcast the Blight spell at 5th level to deal 98 necrotic damage on a creature, since you can still deal half damage to your target if they succeed the spell's constitution save, while also benefiting from the 30 feet range Blight has. Contagion does maintain the ability to impose disadvantage on saving throws against 1 abilities similar to what the diseases do, just without the secondary effects. And it applies the moment the target gets poisoned rather than having to fail 3 saving throws beforehand, which can also be seen as a buff. However, the biggest nerf to this spell is not being able to apply the wacky secondary effects of the aforementioned diseases, which gave this spell its own identity and niche in the game. Now the spell works like any spell in the game essentially, without any quirky mechanics to follow. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially if it means the spell gets to be used more, but it does lose a bit of itself in the process. And as we said before, why cast Contagion for the save or suck effect of dealing 11d8 necrotic damage when you can just deal slightly less but guaranteed damage off of a Blight, even if the creature makes their save? I put a bit of an emphasis on this because both versions of Contagion do require the target to be poisoned before any other effects can happen, which can be tough to do when a lot of creatures are outright immune to being poisoned in the first place. While adding a damage component does add a layer of protection from making Contagion a completely useless spell in most cases, you're also losing what made this spell unique by not being able to apply the funny take double damage effect on a creature you think deserves it. Adding a big damage component also gives the spell more uses inside of combat, which can be fine, but Contagion also kind of felt like its niche best shined outside of combat. You could potentially use this after a combat to infect a bandit leader with flesh rot for 7 days if you didn't get what you want. Although this might be something a big bad evil guy would do if not an evil party member. Or you can inflict an enemy spellcaster with Mindfire to make their turns harder to occur right before major combat if you're on some sort of infiltration mission. While the use cases for the 2014's version of Contagion are only limited by your imagination, there was a special charm to it that was lost in the 2024 version, which is why it takes such a high spot on this list. Because why use the 2024 version of the spell outside of combat if you can just use any other spell in the game to deal big damage? Yeah, you could deal 11d8 necrotic damage to something and maybe kill it, or get it to really lose health out as combat starts, but it doesn't really have the same flair as potentially making the evil king blinded to his kingdom, both figuratively and literally for the next 7 days. And at the number 3 spot on this list, we have the 2nd level cleric spell, Spiritual Weapon. This spell costs a bonus action to cast, has a range of 60 feet, and a duration of 1 minute that doesn't require concentration to maintain. You create a spectral weapon that floats and lasts for the duration, or until you use the spell again. When you cast the spell, you can have it make a melee spell attack against a creature within 5 feet of it, dealing 1d8 plus your spellcasting modifier and force damage. Afterwards, you can spend a bonus action on your turns to move the weapon up to 20 feet and have it attack a creature next to it. This is considered one of the best spells to have because it gives clerics, specifically, the ability to just deal extra damage using their bonus actions on each of their turns. And since this spell doesn't require concentration, they can still concentrate on spells like Bless without having to worry about losing their bonus action. It acted as an extension to a cleric's kit, because you can combine this spell with something like Spirit Guardians to further increase your damage output. Unfortunately, Wizards of the Coast thought that this spell was just way too good, so they decided to change it a little bit. While the spell functions exactly the same, there are 2 major changes, one being a buff and one being a nerf. Since this list is about nerf spells, we'll focus on the nerf the spell received. Like Forcecage, a Spiritual Weapon now requires you to maintain concentration on it, meaning that clerics can no longer have free reign on both damage and support in this way. You have to choose whether you want to have Spirit Guardians up or Spiritual Weapon. Bless or this spell, Beacon of Hope or the funny Ghost Sword. This nerf greatly lowers the functionality of the spell and is no longer just free damage for clerics, which might make this the most nerfed spell in the game, if not for one saving grace, the buff the spell received. Since you're no longer able to just summon your spiritual weapon to give yourself free damage using a 2nd level spell slot, the game now allows it to have much better scaling than before. You see, before, Spiritual Weapon only gained an extra 1d8 force damage every 2 spell slots used above 2nd level. You'd have to cast the spell at 4th level to have it deal 2d8 plus spellcasting mod and force damage, 6th for 3d8, then 8th for 4d8. While an extra 4d8 plus spell mod and force damage as a bonus action was absolutely nice to have as a bonus action with no concentration, it wouldn't really work with its 2024 counterpart, since you could just deal more damage by upcasting basically any other spell. So to fix that, Spiritual Weapon now deals an extra 1d8 force damage for every slot above 2nd, potentially allowing you to deal up to 8d8 plus spell mod force damage when using a 9th level spell slot if you really wanted to. So while the functionality of Spiritual Weapon has been reduced significantly, in that it's no longer just free damage for clerics to have, being able to potentially deal more damage with it in the first place is what saves the spell from being any higher on this list. Providing its counter argument at number 2 on this list, we have everyone's favorite nefarious 3rd level spell, Counterspell. This spell can only be cast as a reaction whenever you see a creature within 60 feet of you casting a spell. When this happens, you attempt to interrupt that creature's casting of the spell it's trying to use. If this spell is of 3rd level or lower, then the spell fails and has no effect. However, if the spell is 4th level or higher, you either have to make an ability check using your spellcasting ability against a DC of 10 plus the spell's level to cause the target spell to fail, or upcast the spell to the appropriate spell level to cause the spell to fail without needing to make a roll for it. This is extremely oppressive, as it means you can just have your spells completely negated without any sort of response, unless you had your own reaction to cast Counterspell on their Counterspell, in which case you'd be using 2 resources to put off that fireball you wanted to cast so badly. However, that's admittedly better when the alternative is losing your entire turn because of this spell. But this doesn't really apply when it comes to high level spells. When your 9th level Meteor Swarm gets countered by a 9th level Counterspell, there's just no recourse since you only have one 9th level spell in the first place, unless you're comfortable making a DC 19 ability check using only your spellcasting modifier. The only exception to this is if you're an Abjuration Wizard, which lets you add your proficiency bonus to the roll as well once you reach 10th level with improved Abjuration, making it much easier to counterspell high level spells using only a 3rd level spell slot. Thankfully, Counterspell received a handful of changes that severely tones down its oppressive nature in the 2024 version of the spell. The first change is minor, as the cast time now also clarifies that it must be a spell that uses verbal, somatic, or material components. This is to help clarify a ruling for magic items where casting spells from them, such as a wand or staff, don't actually use any components unless otherwise stated. This is more for clarification than anything else. As for the rest of the spell, instead of instantly negating the target spell, the creature you're targeting must, instead, make a Constitution saving throw. If they fail, this spell dissipates with no effect, and the action, bonus action, or reaction used is wasted. However, there's an added caveat that also makes the spell less oppressive. If this spell was cast with a spell slot, that slot isn't expended. So while you still might lose your turn due to a poor roll, you would at least have the resources for another try next turn. Having the target roll a con save is also much better than automatically consuming the spell, because it at least gives the creature a chance to still pull out their spell on their own merits. Unfortunately, as a result of this change, Counterspell no longer has any additional effects or power when casting it using higher level spell slots, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. There is also one very important thing to note that isn't listed in the spell's description that also severely tones down how annoying Counterspell can be. On page 236 of the 2024 Player's Handbook, the rules for casting time clarifies that on a turn, you can expend only one spell slot to cast a spell. Before this, if the big bad evil guy used a 3rd level slot to cast Fireball, then you cast Counterspell to stop the Fireball. The big bad evil guy could respond to your Counterspell with their own Counterspell to stop their Fireball from being deleted. However, with this new rule to spell casting, once you get Counterspelled, there's no response. Fortunately, this is balanced by the fact that your spell slot doesn't get consumed anymore, so it's not the worst thing in the world. Honestly, this is one of the few cases where Counterspell being on a con save might actually be a buff for the spell. Before, you had to use your spellcasting modifier without proficiency to beat out the DC of a higher level spell if you wanted to use a 3rd level spell slot. This often meant that you had to really get lucky to counterspell a particularly deadly spell with only a +5 or a +6 modifier, depending on if you're running optimal spellcasting stats with the appropriate stat boosting tomes. However, unlike other spells that target Constitution, Counterspell is usually reserved exclusively for spellcasters who aren't really the best at making con saves to help balance out the fact that they need to maintain concentration on spells, since not being able to break a spellcaster's concentration as a secondary option isn't very balanced. So if your spell save DC is high enough, usually around 23 towards endgame, if you have good magic items, then you can all but guarantee that you'll pull off your counterspell a fair number of times. However, you do use your reaction and a 3rd level spell slot to minorly inconvenience your target, rather than full on making them waste their spell slots. That being said, spell slots aren't the only resource a spellcaster can spend as action economy in general, as a meaningful resource in and of itself. As for why Counterspell takes its number 2 spot on this list, while its overall oppressive nature has been scaled down quite a bit, it does technically get a small buff by allowing creatures to make a con save against your spell save DC rather than a fluctuating number based on the spell slot and having the caster of the spell roll for it. It creates a more consistent experience regardless of what spell is being cast, while feeling less punishing overall. This is probably one of the few examples where toning down a spell actually feels very good. And coming to life at number 1 on this list is the powerful 5th level spell, Animate Objects. This concentration spell takes an action to cast, has a range of 120 feet, and a duration that lasts up to 1 minute. When you cast a spell, you choose up to 10 non-magical items within range that aren't being worn or carried. Depending on the size of the objects, they may count as more than one object. For instance, medium targets count as 2 objects, large targets count as 4, and huge count as 8, with huge being the limit in how big the object you can animate can be. While animated, these objects become creatures under your control until the spell ends, or until their hit points are reduced to 0. And each object has their own statistics based on their size. For example, tiny objects have 20 hit points, an AC of 18, a +8 to hit, deals 1d4 +4 damage, and has a strength and dexterity score of 4 and 18 respectively. While a huge object would have 80 hit points, 10 AC, plus 8 to hit, deals 2d12 plus 4 damage to hit, and has a strength and dexterity score of 18 and 6 respectively. Aside from this, all animated objects possess 10 con, 3 wisdom, and 1 charisma. They also all have a speed of 30 feet and can walk if they have limbs to do so. If not, then they have a flying speed of 30 feet and can hover instead. However, if an object is nailed to something or otherwise securely attached to a surface or a large object, those objects have a speed of 0. The objects also have 30 feet of blind sight, but are blind beyond that distance. In terms of combat prowess, when commanded to attack, objects can make one slam attack against a creature within 5 feet of itself. Its default damage is bludgeoning, but your DM might rule that an object might deal slashing or piercing damage instead, such as if you animated a knife or a spear. With all of this in mind, let's go over why this spell is considered as powerful as it is. Firstly, it only costs a bonus action to command your objects to attack a creature, which is great for the action economy. It's like having a spiritual weapon, except the weapon is now a giant statue that deals 2d12 plus 4 bludgeoning damage against your enemies. Of course, you're still using a 5th level slot instead of a 2nd for a little bit more damage if you use the spell this way. Instead, the way to break this spell completely is to always carry 10 tiny objects with you at all time. The best way to do this is to carry around 10 silver pieces. Drop them onto the ground and then cast Animate Objects on them to create 10 tiny creatures, which can each deal 1d4 plus 4 damage each. With a plus 8 to hit, these coins wouldn't be the most inaccurate things in the world. And if you manage to hit a creature that doesn't resist bludgeoning damage with all 10 coins, that's a massive 10d4 plus 40 bludgeoning damage, or an average of 65 damage that a creature will end up taking. This is some of the highest damage potential in the game, and can compete with the likes of Mental Prison, a 6th level spell with the highest single target damage potential in the game at an 82.5 average psychic damage when the target takes both the initial 5d10 psychic damage and the follow-up 10d10 psychic damage. It even comes close to Disintegrate, which deals an average of 75 force damage. But that only assumes you get to use your animated objects once per cast. Since the spell lasts for up to 1 minute, you could basically deal an average of 65 bludgeoning damage every turn to one creature, or spread the damage out as you see fit. Obviously, this assumes every hit lands, which is never going to be the case. This also doesn't assume critical hits, which might also occur during the course of the spell. Regardless, having such a high damage potential for a 5th level spell can sometimes lead to animate objects being banned or used as an excuse for the DM to retaliate with their own animate objects in the future. Sadly, this all changes in the 2024 iteration of the spell. While the parameters for casting the spell are the same, the first big change to the spell is the amount of objects you're allowed to animate along with which ones. You can no longer animate objects if they're fixed to a surface in any way, and the maximum number of objects you're allowed to animate is now equal to your spellcasting modifier, so up to 5 if you prioritize your ability score increases. Because of this, objects also count differently towards the amount of objects you're allowed to animate. Medium or smaller objects count as 1 object. Large ones count as 2, while huge objects count as 3. The objects can no longer fly if they don't have legs, and instead sprout legs if they don't already have any to move. The objects also count as construct and act as their own creatures, taking their turn immediately after yours during combat. You still have to use a bonus action to command them, however. Already, we've seen a significant reduction in power as you can only animate 5 silver coins, which would result in half the damage per turn as our 2014 cousin. However, it gets a bit worse. Instead of each object dealing damage based on their size, this now applies to only some of them. This is because Animate Objects now has its own stat block for you to follow whenever you use the spell. All animated objects now have a flat 15 AC, speed of 30 feet, blind sight of 30 feet, and all share the same ability score regardless of size. As for what's different between each size, medium and smaller objects and tiny have 10 hit points. Large ones have 20, and huge objects have 40 hit points. The damage they deal is now considered force damage, and the amount of damage is also different, with medium and smaller objects dealing 1d4 plus 3 force damage. Large dealing 2d6 plus 3 plus your spellcasting modifier and force damage, and huge objects dealing 2d12 plus 3 plus your spellcasting modifier and force damage. While dealing force damage is a nice buff, the amount of overall damage your objects can do has been significantly reduced, from an average of 65 bludgeoning damage to an average of 27.5 force damage for 5 tiny objects, which is just slightly less than a fireball, which deals an average of 28 fire damage to a single target. However, this does incentivize the use of larger objects for the spell, as they do deal more damage based on your spellcasting modifier. So if you're a wizard with a 20 intelligence score and choose to animate a large and a huge object, against one target, you'd be dealing 2d6 plus 8 and 2d12 plus 8 force damage to a single target, or an average of 36 force damage per turn. While nowhere near the amount of damage of its former glory days, that's still a pretty decent amount of damage per turn that you can deal. And if you boost your intelligence score to 22 by reading a Tome of Clear Thought, you can bring out 2 huge objects that deal a total of 40d12 plus 18 force damage, or an average of 44 force damage. While these nerfs do technically put the spell more in line with other spells, it's definitely taken the biggest hit of all the spells on this list, simply due to the fact that there isn't really anything that makes the spell overall better to use. It feels a lot cleaner now that it has its own stat block and reads easier by not having a table that only includes some stats while writing the rest of the stats in the spell description, which is nice. And having the damage types of the objects be force is also a nice bonus. But overall, losing over half of its initial power is something that can be felt very easily. While Counterspell did also receive a similar treatment, it at least had a big enough buff to make it feel more consistent across the entire game, while Animate Objects sort of falls off a lot more as better spells become available. Despite popular belief, however, nerfing spells or abilities that are deemed particularly powerful isn't always a bad thing, so long as the loss in power isn't going somewhere else. In this case, making the larger objects more enticing to go to, and having the damage type be force are definitely big ups in terms of trade-offs. That being said, Animate Objects does still take the top spot on this list because it is the one spell that has received some of the harshest nerfs out of every spell on this list, even if these changes felt necessary. Whether that means Animate Objects is still a good spell or not, however, is an answer best left up to the players and the DMs that use it.